Hi everybody, welcome back to another video. I will be looking at Power Query today, and I've been playing around with Power Query a little bit, and specifically the M language that comes with Power Query. Now, I went through some tests and some headaches trying to figure some of this stuff out, but I managed to finish what I set out to do. So in this video, I will go through the things that I figured out based on the M language and Power Query, and how I went by doing that by using parameters, using if and if logic, etc. So today should be a interesting video, I think, for you if you have been working with Power Query up to this point, and you get to see some of the kind of changes you can do to your query in the advanced editor in Power Query to manipulate all the steps that you normally take to do a transfer and load scenario. So hang tight and let's get started. So before I start, I just want to point out a couple of sources you can use to find some more information about this. And I went into this. I'll put these in the description to the video, but these are some of the sources you can use. So here is the Power Query documentation from Microsoft. Here is the Power Query M formula language documentation. And if you want to get a little better working with Power Query, there are plenty of YouTube videos out there. One that I found interesting was by this Goodly guy, this guy. And he goes through a lot of the small little parts of Power Query and how to write it into the advanced editor, etc. He discusses some of the M language as well. I would not have time to go through all this stuff in this video because it would just be too much. But he will discuss how you can, what is a record, what is a list, what is a table, how do you manipulate each thing, how do you drill into them, etc. So it's a pretty good explanation he offers in this video playlist. So make sure you take a look at that, and he has some other kind of playlists too. But the one that I was kind of digging into to try to come up with some of the answers along other sources was the playlist for the Power Query. So make sure you check out this guy and his videos. He does a pretty good job, actually. Okay, so I want to start going through what we will be developing today. So what I have here is I have a workbook I created. So let me show that to you here. And let me zoom in a little bit so you can see it better. That should be probably good right there. So let me expand this a little bit. So what we're looking at here is a spreadsheet that extracts data from a Power Query and loads it into this sheet. And also on the right hand side here, you can see these are all the connecting queries I'm using to make this happen. Now I'm pretty sure I could simplify this, but it serves as a good illustration of how each step is created for this particular Web API call. And also I want to show you how you can use parameter tables and functions along with M language logic inside the advanced editor. So before we get going here, I want to show you the raw source of the data we're trying to extract from on the Yahoo Web API. Okay, so I ran the URL inside the Insomnia application here, and it returns this structured JSON file. So notice it starts with a keyword chart, and then it goes into a dictionary object, if you will, or what do you call it, key value pair. So the key value is a result, and then it has a list object here that consists of all this stuff. So as you drill into this, you can see here that there is a field called chart, result, first list, 0, and then meta, And then meta, if you expand on it, it has all these key value pairs. And some of them we're going to be extracting, like the symbol. We're going to be extracting things like down here will be data granularity, for example, and the range. So stuff like that we can still grab out of this metadata. Another thing we're going to be grabbing is the timestamps. Notice the timestamp is also a list of numbers. In this case, these are just numbers, and we'll get back to how to interpret these in a little bit. So we're going to grab the timestamp. Under indicators, we're going to drill further down. We got to get into this quote block, and here is another list of these different blocks here. So here is a list of low, close, at high, etc. And each one of those will have its own value, which is a list in turn. So we have to bring all this stuff in. And finally, when we get further down here, when we pass the, let's bring up the quote. We're also going to grab this adjusted close here, like this, you can see here. And we're going to grab those values. So the real challenge will be to, how do you connect all this stuff? Because you can't just drill in. You have to go to each of these sections and stitch it together somehow. And the way we're going to do that is, because it's sequential, this is first, this is second, and therefore the timestamps, this is first, this is second, and we're going to stitch it together using indexes. So we'll get back to how that. But this is the overall look and feel of the JSON that we're going to be working with. So somehow we need to create some kind of index values to stitch all this stuff together. And we're going to do it in Power Query. Yes, I know. It's not a simple task, but we got to use Power Query to do this. And that's what this video is all about. So before I go into the details of how this works, I want to show you how this actually is put together. Notice I got this Query Final tab, which is, as you can guess, is the final query that basically spits out the results. Then I have this Input tab. This one here is what's called a parameter table that we're going to be using inside our Power Query. And again, let me zoom in a little bit. As you can see, it has a symbol, an interval, date range, and whether or not you want to calculate rate of returns, and if so, what type of return do you want to calculate. So if you look at this, how this is built up, there is these parameters, and then there's a side table here that basically links to this description as you select it. And then finally, we have the VBA behind this button that's going to actually refresh this when we execute this. Then I have this lookup table, and in the lookup table, I have basically the tickers, and I have company descriptions. Then I also set up intervals you can select to use in your queries. So anything from 1 minute to 3 months, like here, you can see here. And then we have a date range, anywhere from 1 day to max range, whatever the data is for. Whether it's 10 years, 5 years, 2 years, what have you. And then I have this yes/no lookup value for if you want to calculate a return. And I have a simple or log type of calculation you can perform on those returns. So where is this stuff coming from, this piece? Well, I have another query here that I use. That is this query get S&P 500. And basically what it does, it goes out to this website and it grabs this table here and it populates this one here. So for example, whenever you run this stuff under your queries and connections, you have this button you can refresh all. When you press that, it goes out there and it grabs this data and it fills it in or refreshes this table. So these are all the 500 some stocks that you find in the S&P 500 index. As you can see here, it goes up to 503 in this case. And I have some additional market cap, stock price, last one, percentage change, etc. here. Okay, so that's this query get SP 500. So let me demonstrate how this works first, and then I'll go into the details of how the queries are constructed. So let's say you go in here now, and I want to choose a ticker symbol. And what I've done is I've gone here into this data validation. I select it into a list, and then I'm looking up these values, as you can see, in the ticker or symbols column of the S&P 500. So that's how I get the values in my drop list here. So if you look, you can see I have all these ticker symbols I can use here. And another thing that is kind of nice is, let's say I'm looking for any stock that starts with AB. So as you can see, it basically filters it down so you can select one of these guys. So let me choose this one, and you can see over here it uses a lookup formula based on this value, and it goes to that lookup table in A2 through B504, and it goes 2 over because it was the second column. So what I'm saying is I'm using this ticker here to look up the value here, and then I'm reading this off and populate this field right here. So that's all there is to that one. Then I have a similar thing for choosing the intervals, and for date range, I'm setting up the same thing, a data validation, a list type, and here is where I'm looking it up. So that basically comes from here and here. So that's the date range and interval lookup. And then I have the rate of return, which again is this range right here, yes or no if you want to compute it. And then finally I have this, what type of return do you want to calculate? You want a log return or you want a simple return? And that one comes from this one here. So that's my parameter table, okay? And over here, it's simply based on whatever I select over as a symbol, based on whatever I select over here, it will fill in these type of formats. So notice it relates back to this input table here at C5. And then after that is just basically VLOOKUP for that symbol against this table here. So that's all that is. Okay, I just want to say a couple of words about the refresh of the actual query final query. If you look here, I have a big button here, and that big button was created so I could actually call my macro, or the VBA code, if you will. So the way to do that, you go to File, you go to Options, and then you go into Customize Ribbon. And when you look at all the tabs here, you can see there's one for developer. Make sure that that is checked. And when you say OK now, that will show up here on a ribbon. And if you look, there's all kinds of things you can do. In order to create one of these buttons, what you want to do is you want to go to Insert, and then you have two types. You have ActiveX control and the original form controls. I created mine with the ActiveX, but you could also create one for like a regular button, a form control. So the way I did it, I grabbed one of these, I dragged it out like this, go into Properties, this one, and your property window will show up, and you can rename the button. For example, you can say CMD refresh or something like that. And then you can also, in the caption here, you can say what you want it to be saying. So refresh, for example, something like that. And then close this window here. And in order to activate some code, you can click on this thing, and notice it's in design mode. If you want to activate it, you uncheck this design mode. Right now I got it selected, so I can double click. And when I double click, the VBA code will actually open up. Notice I have one already. This is just command 1 button, which is the one that I'm using. And all it does is calling this refresh function. I mean, the subroutine, I'm sorry. Notice this is a private sub sitting inside this input worksheet. So I didn't put my code there because I want it to be global, meaning I want to be able to move between these sheets, for example. If I'm stuck in here, it'll be difficult to do. So I created another macro, which is in the module 1 here. And if you look at this one, let me see if I can zoom in. Basically, what it says is that I say refresh, sub refresh, and I say select the query final worksheet, and then active workbook refresh all. and that will refire all the Power Queries. So the whole sheet will refresh. Then what I do is I call the range object and I point to this query final sheet, and there is so if I go back there, you can see here's the query final, Alt F11 to bring back my code. As you can see here, I'm using this technique. This is the table, and if you look at this table here, you can see it's called query final. That's the table. Okay, so behind the scenes, it created that name for it. So what I'm doing here is I'm referring to that table here, and I'm going to this date time column, which is this one here, because I want to format that one. So that's why I'm doing calling into it. And then I'm calling the data section. Notice in this one here, I'm calling the header section on the symbols column. So all that will do is select this one cell called symbols up here. And this one here selects all the data. So if you want to see it in action, I can step into it. All you have to do is put your cursor somewhere inside and press F8. And notice now it's in yellow. Now it's going to step through. And notice what happens in the background as I step through this. So now I'm going to let me just go to a different sheet here first. And right now I'm on the lookup sheet. So I go F8 again, and it refreshes everything. Here, you can see it. So because it went to this and refreshed everything. Now the next thing will be to format this if it's not already formatted. And I'm going to use this custom formatting for the dates. So formatting it, and then finally I'm selecting the first cell in this workbook, the top one, the symbol one. So you can see here, it shows the symbol one up here. So that's what this macro is doing. And the way this is called is this macro is sitting inside the module one, but from the input sheet, I'm calling the macro by its name, which is called refresh, as you can see. So that's all there's to the VBA code that I'm using in order to fire off this. So when you actually do something here, you can say, let's just bring a different ticker in maybe, and then refresh, and boom, it's done. So that's how that works. So let's test this now so I can show you some of the things you can do with it. All right, so right now I got this symbol. The interval is 1 day. So I'm gonna get daily data. And then what I want to do is I want to get it for 1 month maybe. Do I want to compute the rate of return? Yes. And okay, do I want to compute the simple rate of return? Yes. All right, so let me refresh that query, and here's the data. Notice it came back with this adjusted close simple return, and it based it on this adjusted close. And here you can see the return calculations. So if I go back now, and the reason it calculated based on the adjusted close is because whenever you have when you have interval is a day or more, it will use the adjusted close column to base its calculations on. And the reason why I can't do that otherwise is because it doesn't get there is no adjusted close value available when you're going into hours or you're going into all these minutes and all that stuff. So all this stuff is logic that I'm using inside my Power Queries. So I'm going to show you a little bit how that works. So now let's try another one here, but now I want hourly. Because I want hourly data, I don't want so much data. So let's just set the interval to be maybe 1 day, so once per hour. And let me change it this time to a log return, okay? So I'm still going to calculate the return. So I refresh that, and notice now it came back, but there's no adjusted close. And the reason for that is because I'm calculating per hours. Here is 1:30, here is 2:30, here is 3:30, here is 4:30, and so on this date. So as you can see, I'm getting hourly data here. There is this timestamp and there's this date time, and I'm going to show you the relationship between those in a little bit here. But notice the column now, it's called close log returns. Close. So if I go back now and I change instead of a log return, I'm changing it to a simple return, and I run it again. Notice now it's called close simple return. So all that magic happens in the M language inside these queries. And I will show that in a little bit. Also notice, because I'm doing per hour here, it doesn't bring back the adjusted close. If I change that, if I went back here now and I said, hey, do it one per day and do it for a month maybe. Okay, refresh. And notice now it's once per day, the 13th, the 14th, the 15th, and it actually based the adjusted close calculation here for the returns. And the reason I did it because I chose simple, and notice it says adjusted close simple returns, because that's what I chose here. Okay, so now you've seen that, and there's one more scenario I want to just show you. What if I say I don't want to see the rate of return? I can say no and refresh it. And notice now it's gone. That column is not showing up. And all that is taken care of inside this query final calculation. Okay, so now that you've seen the application, let's dig into how I did this. So the first thing I want to show you is this function that I have. So let me go and edit that. And in Power Query, this is what it looks like when you actually... Okay, one more thing. Let me take one step back. Let me exit out of here. If you want to go and basically get into Power Query, I can shut off the visibility here by clicking this on the Data tab. Another thing I can do is I can go to Get Data. You go to From Other Sources, and you go down to Blank Query like this. And now you are what is called a step. And if you go to this View tab and you click Advanced Editor, now you can see the M code behind here. So for example, if I just changed it here and I said Tor, for example, what this tells you is this let statement is basically the beginning of steps. So here's the first step. My first step is Tor. And then if I want to add manually steps here, I can do a comma. And then I can give it some name. And maybe I want to say hello world. But notice there is a space between here. And in Power Query, whenever you have space between words, you have to prefix the step with this hash sign and then quotes. So this is how you would do that. Let me see if I can zoom in. If you're in Windows here and you're in Advanced Editor, if you want to zoom in and out, there you can press the Control Shift minus key like this, or Control Shift plus key to zoom in. As you can see, that works fine. You can also, in Excel, you can just press the Control Alt plus and minus key if you want to zoom in on a spreadsheet, on a worksheet, I should say. Okay, notice here I got some errors because I was getting ahead of myself here. One step can follow another step. So notice I say source here. When I hit enter now, notice it gives me back Tor, because that's the step I'm outputting. So after the in is whatever step you want to output. If I want to work on this source field, I can also say something like this. And when I run this now, I can hit enter again, and it will still output Tor, okay? Now, in order for me to choose this step, I will have to replace the source output here with this step right here. So now when I hit enter, you can see now I'm getting this output. Another thing you can do in Power Query, I can move this up and down. So notice here I moved the hello world to be the first step and the source to be the second step. You have to separate steps by comma. And the last step cannot have a comma, and that's why I'm getting this error here. So if I try to hit it again, you can see I'm getting an error because it cannot proceed, it says. When you see that, remove the last one here and hit enter, and then you'll be okay. So the point here is that you can output any one of these steps here after the in clause, as you can see here. One more thing I should say too, inside here or in the advanced query editor, what you can do is you can move these steps up and down. In Windows, inside here, I simply hold the Alt key and I do up or down button. So here I'm doing down, here I'm going up, up. So you can switch it around. I can do the same thing in the advanced editor. So in order to zoom in, Control Shift plus, and then to move steps, put on the line you want to be at, and go Alt up or down. And that's, and again, if you bring it up and down, make sure you put the parenthesis, the comma in the right place. So like here. Okay, so now we have the beginning of this stuff. Okay, so that's just a couple of steps there. Notice here I have a source, that's a step, is equal to Tor. Here I'm actually creating a function. And what I'm doing is I name it func equal to, and here I'm putting a parenthesis, I'm passing in this value to that function. And the function is written like this, as you can see, equal to and greater than. And then I'm passing in the previous step, which is Tor, and then I combine it with the parameter that I'm passing into this function here. So the function call is like this, function with parenthesis, and then I'm passing in some text here, and then I create an output step equal to calling that function. And then that's the one I want to see in the output. So when I say done now, notice it says Tor is writing functions. And that's exactly what I had in the parameter here. So that's how you can do like a function here. Another way we can do a function is, and that's the one I want to get to now, is this fn get parameters. It looks like this. So let me go into my advanced editor and let me zoom in on this so you can see it better. So here I'm putting the function like this, and then I'm passing in this name, the parameter name, as, and I designed it as a text value. So here is that, that equal to greater than for the functions. And then I want to do some steps inside this function. So I'm using the let keyword, and then I create a name. I'm going to call it parent source, and it's going to be equal to this Excel current workbook we're in here. Then the name is going to be parameters. So what that really means is that relates back to that parameter table and its content, and that's what this is doing. If you go to the input here, select parameters, notice it selects these parameters here. And that's the parameters table I'm referring to. So I'm saying the current workbook, which is this, the parameters table, content. And then I'm just going to look for the name and the value. So the parameter and the value. Okay, so notice here is that name of that table is parameters. And the content is all of it, all the stuff in it. Then what I want to do is I want to refer back to this step, which I did up here, that points back to that table. And I'm going to select a row from that table, which is this one here, okay, the parameters. So basically what we're going to do is we have an each statement. That means for each row, it's going to go through here and it's going to extract the value, okay, based on the name. It's going to go for each. That's a key word. That means you're going to cycle through this whole thing, each row, and I'm going to extract out the record, as you can see here, where it's equal to this parameter name, I should say, that I'm passing in. I want to get the symbol. So remember, it's case sensitive, so you got to make sure you write it the right way. So symbol, and I say invoke, you can see it returned a null. It should have returned as A, B, and B. So let's try to figure out why it didn't do that. Oh, because it's a capital S. That's why it didn't work. Let me try one more time. So it's case sensitive, so you got to be careful. So what's going to happen now? It should return the value of that ticker symbol in the parameter table because I have loaded that into this table. So if I go invoke now, here you can see is the ticker that coming back from that table, from that particular value, if you will. The parameter, to get parameters, basically you're passing in a different value, a different name for the value you're trying to retrieve, is to read this one, this one, this one, this one, and this one. That's how we're going to get these value, and based on that, we're going to do logic. All right, So the first thing we need to do is to get our data. So let's see how I do that. Notice I got symbol is this, A, B, and B. Interval is 1 day, and this is 1 month. So when I go back to my first query here, the startup query, it's called query get Yahoo data. And you can see there's a record, list, and a record. So this query then, I use the let keyword to get some steps here. The first step is I name it symbol, and I can do that without the hashtag and quote because I don't have any space in the name. So I'm going to call that function we just looked at, and I'm going to pass in the keyword symbol, the interval, and the date range, and I'm going to load them into these values here. So let's look at that and see what it does. So first we have a symbol. It returns this from this function, A, B, and B. Then the interval is 1 day. The date range is 1 month. So these are simply the calls to the function itself. And then I have this source. So what is this doing? Well, there's some JSON document stuff here. So let's go and look at how I construct that. I create a source step, and I'm going to use the JSON document function, and I'm going to place a web contents URL here. And the way I do that one is I take the parts that are static, like this piece, and then I combine it with those parameters I just extracted out from the table, symbol, interval, and date range. And in order to concatenate, you can do this technique. You can use, just like in Excel and formulas, you can do and, the ampersand, and then the name of the variable, and continue, and then quotes. So you're building the text string dynamically like this. So here's the interval portion, and here's the date range portion. So that's the URL I'm going to be calling, the Web API. Then what I'm going to do is, remember when I showed you the insomnia? I'm looking for drilling into that thing. I want to construct the output from this particular query so I can reuse it over and over and just look for different parts of it. So notice I have from the source step here, from this, I'm going to extract the chart. And then I'm going from the chart, which is this step, I'm going to extract the results. And then from the results, I'm going to extract out this result 1. And then, I'm sorry, I'm going to extract this record out. This is a record, actually. This one is the first record you get to. And then I'm going to convert that record into a table. So I'll get the source. So as you can see here, chart record, right? So the next thing will be to extract out from the chart. And here I can extract it out from there, the list. And it's from the result is the list. And then I extract out the record, and then I extract out the meta portion. And again, this goes back to the drilling into this JSON file. Remember we talked about this? And the first thing that happens up here is chart, result, and then you have a meta, and then you have these other timestamps, but they're under a different header. So you can see timestamp is one of them. Then under indicators, there's a quote, and then it's the high, low, and all that stuff. So if you look at it here, I have drilled in like this, and then I convert it to a table, and then the meta, timestamp, and indicators. And under the indicators, there was 2 more keywords. One of them is going to be for the quote, which is going to contain the high, low, close, volume, and so forth. And one is going to be for the adjusted close. So we still have to drill in. But I'm just setting this up. So in the next few queries, I can refer back to this. So here, now I got it this way. But what I really want to do is I want to use the meta and timestamp indicators to be table headers. So I'm going to transpose this table here. And then I'm going to move these values upwards. So when I promote that, these becomes the header values, as you can see. And then I want to change the type. So it becomes like this. Okay, so right now it's in a format that I can reuse. So I leave that query alone now. So query get Yahoo data is done. Now the next thing will be to go and extract out the timestamps. So I got this query for that. And if you look at this query, the first thing I do is to grab out this symbol here. the symbol, if you look at it, where's that coming from? Well, that comes from the query we just looked at that builds this. And remember, one of those columns was called meta. And here what I'm doing is I'm going in to this first row and I'm grabbing from the first row the symbol column, and that has this value in it. So I can navigate now and I can get to this timestamp portion. And when I do that one, I can convert that to a table. And all the details of this is a little much to go through everything. So I think you just need to read from the advanced query editor, because I really can't go through every little detail here. Okay, so this from list comes from this step here, source. And what I'm doing now is I'm expanding this column so I get all the values. And notice these values are these numbers. So this is the timestamps, but the numbers is Unix timestamp. So what does that mean? Unix timestamp basically says these are the number of seconds since midnight of January 1st, 1970. So these are seconds after that particular date. So that's what a Unix timestamp is doing. So what we have to do, we have to add an index, because every one of these queries I want to have an index on, so I can basically connect them afterwards. So here I'm simply building an index column. Then I reorder it, so I can move that to the first part. And then what I do is I rename the columns from column 1 to timestamp. And then I add a custom. And this is where I convert the Unix timestamp into actual dates. So let's take a quick look at how I do that. I basically call it date time, this new column I'm adding. And it comes from the previous step, as you can see, which was the rename columns. And then what I do is for each row, that's what each keyword is doing. I'm doing this date time, which is basically a conversion of this date. So what does that mean? It's the year, it's the month, it's the day, and then it's the hour, minute, and second. So I'm taking that date, timestamp, and I'm adding, and you can use this duration. And the way that works is you plunk in what are you adding to this date. In my case, I'm adding seconds. Seconds since January 1st, 1970. And that I'm getting from the timestamp column. So I'm basically adding this to that date. And then I can format it and make it look like an actual date here. So that's what this step is doing. It converts it into an actual date. Then I'm adding a symbol in, as you can see, a custom column. And then I reorder the columns again so I can get in different order. So if I look at the actual advanced editor for this step, these steps, as you can see, this is what it looks like. And again, you can step through this on your own and basically look at how I'm doing all this. Here, for example, notice how I get to the symbol. I'm calling this Yahoo Get Data. I'm calling this field meta, and I'm grabbing the first row because there's only one row in there, remember? And that I'm grabbing the symbol field. So in other words, if you go back to that query again, I'm going into meta. I'm drilling into this meta here. So notice I can extract this meta, and then what I'm looking for is the symbol, which is this one. So it'll be the first symbol I'm looking for. And that I'm getting from that value, if you will. So if I go back to timestamps again, the advanced editors, that's what this is doing. It drills in and get that particular value. So I can just refer back to this query here and get that. And here I refer back to that query to get the timestamp and load it into source. So at this time, I have the timestamps. And now I add index and so forth to that. So that's this query, and that will look like this when you're done with it. So far, so good. And I have an index here. The next thing I want to solve is this query open, high, low, close. That looks something like this. I have the source, and again, I'm using the same technique. Call that query up here. This time, drill into indicators. Take the first one you get to here, and then get the quote column, and then 0. Let's go to indicators, and that gives you this record. Then I want to drill into the record, because each record now is a list. So if you click in here now, you can see it breaks into 2 parts. I notice the 0 here, right? So when I do that part, you can see I'm getting this now. There's 2 lists in here. So the one I'm interested in is this quote. You can see I'm getting another record here. And the record I'm interested in, when I click on it, notice it gives you the 0 again. What I need to do then is to use this list, first list here. So hit enter again, and now you can see I have close, volume, high, low, and so on. And they're all lists, okay? If I drill into one of them, you can see here is the actual value. So I go to source, here it is, and then the next one is to convert it to a table. It looks like this. Expand the values. Now I got all the values. And if you look at it now, I got close, then I got volume, then I got high. But I don't really want it in this format. I really want to, basically what I want to do is I want to get all the close together. I want to group all the close, but I also want to add an index because I need to be able to stitch this together. So what I'm going to do, the first step I do, I group it. And when you do this, you can see I'm grouping this previous steps values, which is this, what we just looked at. And I call it name. And then I call it the other column here, add data. And for each, this particular underscore, when you use the each keyword, what that means is, it means each row, basically, each row. It's whatever row you're on, that's the current row. You can use this underscore, whatever it is, to find it. And then I'm doing a type table, and then I'm giving the name is text value, and the number is going to be of numeric. The value is going to be numeric. So that groups the stuff. And then what I want to do, I want to remove that first column we saw. So I want to remove this name column. I remove that. Then I add a custom one. And this is interesting. I'm adding a custom column. And if you look at this column now, if I click here, notice down here, it has 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on the close. And all of these are close. So each one of these tables gets its own individual index. When I click on the next one, you can see it here is for volume. Here it's for high. And the reason that works is because I grouped it first. And then I added this custom index. I start at 1, as you can see here. And I can base it on this added data, which is basically a table of tables. And by doing it this way, I'm able to get indexes that are sequentially built based on the values that are sequentially built. And I got it for each group. Now what I can do, I can remove that added data, the add data column, and then I can expand it. And by doing this expand table column, and what happens is that you basically get it to look like this. You have the close, you have the index for each one. So when you look now, you can see there's for close, and then it starts over again for volume. And this the last thing I want to do then is I simply want to pivot this so I can get them into columns. So close becomes a header, volume becomes a header, and so forth. So I use this pivot step to do that. As you can see here, table pivot based on the previous step. And then I'm doing a list distinct of name and value. So this one here now will actually pivot it around. And you can see I got an index, which is 1, 2, 3. For close, volume, high and low, and open. So this now has actually built an index on every one of these tables, close table, the volume, and so forth, and pitched it together into a table format with the close, volume, and so forth being the headers. So that's probably the more difficult one to get, along with the final query that I'm doing. That was the open, high, low, close. And then the final one is the adjusted close. And that's pretty straightforward. You basically drill in to get the adjusted close like this from this query here. So you're drilling in here to get to it. It's like record, you're drilling to this list, you get this record, and then you have another list, and that's the adjusted close. So you basically drill in, but instead of doing it over all these steps, I do it in one shot. Source, get to the adjusted close, and then get that particular adjusted close values, and then convert it to a table. And then you rename the columns for the column 1 to adjusted close. Then you add the index, and then you reorder and put the index first in first order, and then you return the last step. Okay? So that's the adjusted close. Then what I do, I basically want to merge this in 2 steps. So I merge time with this open, high, low, close, this one. So that query now becomes a merge query. So how do you do that? Well, notice the source is going to be a nested join on tables where I refer back to this query timestamps on the index column. And I would also refer back to this query open, high, low, close that we just created, that table on the index column. I want to inner join it like this. So that's what this is going to be doing. Okay, so this query is going to be merged in this query on the index column, and I'm going to inner join it. And then here, I'm going to expand on it. And I'm just going to basically list all the columns, as you can see here, up through close. And then I remove one column. So let's see what that will look like. So if I go back a little bit here and go to the source, this is what the source looked like right now. So notice I got the timestamps. So the timestamp is already expanded. Then you have this other one that is a table. So here we expand on that table. And by doing that, you're getting the index, open, high, low, volume, and close. And there's 2 indexes now. This index comes from the time query, and this index comes from the open, high, low, close query. So there's 2 of them. But we have merged on the index, so they should be the same now. Then finally, I remove that one index column that was repeated. So that's what this does. Finally then, we get to the most involved query called query final. I want to be extracting out the frequency, and the frequency is calling this metadata from, if you remember up here, this metadata here. So if you go to record, it's going to extract out the frequency. So the one I'm interested in is the data granularity, this one here. So that's the one I want to extract out of the. Okay, so back to query final and go to the calc frequency and navigate to that value, 1 day, as you can see. And then I create another variable and I call it temp calculate adjusted close. Now, what does that mean? Well, I'm basically drilling in to a list. So I create a list like this, and I have these values. So what this is, these are the values that you can pass into that Web API call that will allow you to return adjusted close prices. Anything other, like an hour, 30 minutes, what have you, does not produce an adjusted close value. So I don't want to include the adjusted close value if it's not one of these. If it is one of these, I want to calculate the rate of return, if you want it, based on the adjusted close. If I don't find it here, meaning it's 30 minutes or 90 minutes, what have you, I will not use the adjusted close. But if you still want the rate of return, I will use the close value. So that's what I'm looking for here. Notice it gives you a true, and what this tells me is that in my spreadsheet, I have it set to 1 day or something like that. So that's what this one is doing, is returning a true or false. And then this one here, I'm calling the rate of return parameter from that parameters table. And it tells me I didn't want to calculate the rate of return. So it returns a no. And then what I'm doing is, what kind of rate of return are you want to, if you were going to calculate it, which one would you have chosen? Well, it sits at simple right now from that table in Excel. So I would calculate the simple rate of return. The reason, because the formulas from the adjusted close log return or the close log return is different than the simple return, the way you compute it. I have the source, which is going to be this table. And again, I'm doing another merge here, as you can see. And this needs a little explanation. So let's go to the advanced editor. Okay, so this one is a little more involved, as you can see. So Control-Shift++. So here I'm grabbing all the stuff from parameters table, as you can see. I'm getting all those 5 values from the value column in the parameters table. Then I'm checking to see if the frequency, what that is. So notice what I'm doing. Then I'm creating another step, call it source. Then I'm saying if this one, if you're going to calculate, meaning this one here, if it has one of these values, it will be true. Otherwise, it'll be false. So I'm saying if true, then what I want to do is I want to include the adjusted close query into this. So I use a let statement here because I need to create some intermediate variables. I'm saying table nested joint. I'm going to join this query that we just created on the index column with this query, which is the adjusted close query. Because if it is not, if it's one, like 30 minutes, 90 minutes, what have you, I will not use this adjusted close query. And if that's the case, I simply want to only include this one. So that's what this one is doing. Since I'm using intermediate steps here in the let statement, I need to output one of them. And here I'm creating this nested thing. I do a merge. I expand the table column on this step here, as you can see. And then I give it some column names. And then I return that step. Otherwise, I return this query. So that's what this is doing. This part says returns equal to, if calculate returns, meaning if we want to calculate returns, in the parameter table, it will be a yes or no. If it is yes, then I ran another if test. I say, do I calculate the adjusted close? If that one is true, then I will basically create a dynamic column from this source step, and I will call it adjusted close plus simple or log returns. So it builds that header dynamically. For each row, I'm going to check to see if the index is greater than 1, the index column is greater than 1. If so, I want to check and see if it's a log return. If so, I need to compute the previous rows, the previous turn adjusted close value. And you do that from this source step where index minus 2. The reason for that is because my indexes right now are starting at 1. But internally, Power Query uses index values of 0. So my first row that I can compute a rate of return on will be the second row. So I basically subtract 2 here from the index to get it back to where it should be. So it's a little backwards, a little hard to understand. If I set up the index to start at 0, I would simply subtract 1 here. Okay, so I get that, and I'm grabbing the index minus 2, that row, and that is the value in this column I'm grabbing. And I call that previous adjusted close. Then I create another variable, and I do my actual computation here. So I'm using the natural log formula. I grab that particular adjusted close value and divide on the previous one. And that's the adjusted close rate of return log return. And then I output the last step I did here. Then if it's not a log, it's simple, then I do an else statement. And I say, hey, do the same thing, but use the simple calculation. So here I'm doing the same thing. calculate the previous adjusted close. But here I'm using the simple rate of return calculation. Adjusted close minus previous adjusted close divided on previous adjusted close. And then I return that one. If index is not greater than 0, simply put a null. So in the adjusted rate of return column, the first one will be null. And that's what that one is doing. And then as part of this bigger if statement here, if you're going to calculate it, then do all this stuff, check if it's simple or adjusted log return. Else, if it's false, 30 minutes or 90 minutes, what have you, right? I still, if you said yes, I want to calculate returns, I still have to calculate returns, but I'm not going to have an adjusted close column. But what I will have is a close column. So that's what this is doing. So it's the same as before, but I will not have an adjusted close value. So I have to use the close value. And then at the very outer query here, if you want to calculate returns, is yes. Otherwise, I return the source, not the return calculation set, because I don't want to add that column if not. Okay, so that's how I built this application here that gets the stock prices from Yahoo Finance in Power Query. So I hope you liked this video, and if you do, give me a like and perhaps consider subscribing to my channel.